Hello again for more explainers. Ooh, yes. Quick note, when you're grabbing files and getting started, keep in mind that the one that's labeled EC video script is the original. That's the working draft. And then the one that's labeled as ARTSTUDIO 388 Fall 2019 script. This is the edited version. This is the one that was used in the voiceover. And when you look at it, you'll see that it's divided out a little bit more along the lines of how the voiceover was delivered. So this one is the best one to follow. There's a few things that have been edited out or adjusted here or there. But I think if you compare the two, they're pretty close. And this way, it's a little bit easier to spot out where perhaps even the different frames that you might be illustrating would be, or how the sequence is going to break down. Now, again, to go back to Illustrator, where I was designing my assets, remember that you can always design your assets somewhere else. If you wanted to do something with more textures, you might be working in Photoshop or using maybe collage images. That's something else people have done in the past. They've taken a bunch of photos and then cut and pasted and sort of made this kind of collage-y type of motion graphic for this explainer, and all of that works just fine. But I'm just showing you here in Illustrator because that's where I feel comfortable doing this kind of graphic work. Remember, it's pretty wide open for your style, and that's something we'll talk about when we look at your design boards. Now, I also made a library of colors for my project based on which ones I was selecting and what I thought were going to work together well. You'll notice that it's not just red, white, and blue, like super saturated colors. This scheme is related to that and is somewhere a little bit more muted. I'm also using a purple because of purple states and all that kind of stuff. So there's some relevant information about why I'm choosing those colors and how they're working together. Also, in terms of typefaces, I chose something that looked a little bit more representational of like a document or kind of like Times New Roman, but a little bit fancier than that, or a little bit different version. In any case, I'm trying to get closer to coming up with how that style is going to work. Now, as I do my design boards, I want to plan for all of the assets that I might need to build into a project. And I, start to make my list, and I start to figure out, what do I need to create? And that's where I will take the jump from design boards and sort of planning or pre-visualization to production. And as far as production goes, what I started with here was building a little bit different type of document than what we did in the last project, where we were perhaps creating some layouts that were very specific to how things fit in the frame or how large we wanted them to appear. This approach to generating assets is similar to what we would do if we were making like a sprite sheet or something like that. Essentially, what I'm creating is a document that has all of the graphic assets that I need to use in my project for my animation. And that way I'm not importing 20 compositions from where I was working to design them. I'm more or less bringing in one or two things, and then I can divide up the elements as needed later on. One of the things that I also try to make sure to do when I'm working this way is to divide up my layers based on what those assets are. Because when I import from different software, those layers will be treated differently on their import. And so if I have a sense of how I want to use them or what goes with what, or I divide them up and organize my work file before I import it, that will give me an easier way to manage those assets later on. In addition, I will be converting these over to shape layers, in which case if I did need to modify something, like maybe I want the stars to spin or something like that, I can still go into that layer and make that adjustment. Inside of the shape layer, it will be part of the contents. So let's say, imagine that I had built in more of these assets and I was ready to start moving into doing motion testing or other kind of work. Then when I jump over to After Effects, I'm ready to, let's say, save out my first version. So I'm going to go find in my project organization Electoral College test. Let's say motion test, and give it a version number. So at this point, now I will be able to track my way back to my assets, which were in my Illustrator directory. Remember always, and you'll see me forget this every single time until I step back and do it over again. I want to composition retain layer sizes. And then I'm ready to get started. So I've got all of my assets. It's also got my color swatches in there if I need them. Otherwise, because I made a library, that library is also available. And I'm just going to go ahead and make a new composition because I want to test things out. So I'm going to choose the appropriate dimensions for my document. And then I'm going to add my layer solid. And nice thing here is for something like layer solids, I should just be able to sample that way. And then if I want to start seeing how these elements are going to fit in the frame and work as shape layers, I can just do that really quickly. And I can turn on my title safe and action safe, and I can always refer back to my design boards if I want to get a sense of how these elements are going to work and how they're going to be animated. Now that I've got those assets into one location, I can literally just dump them into my new compositions. I can create times for these based on whatever I think is appropriate for that segment. If I wanted to be a little bit more, diligent about that work, I would go to my voiceover and I would bring that into my composition here for testing, and I would play that in my composition, and I would add markers just like I did in the kinetic typography project so that I knew where specific moments hit, and then I'd start to animate based on some of that. So in this case, maybe I want this guy to scale up to this size from nothing. So he sort of like flies onto the screen, and then around this time, I want it to sort of scale back down, let's say to 15. And then after it does that, or as it's doing some of that, I also want to keyframe it to the corner position where I had it in my design board. So it's a quick prototyping process. I would still add some easing into here, but I'm getting there. And now when I animate in my Wisconsin on top of that to be central in my frame based on my plan, I have a good starting point for getting there. So that's kind of my next steps. And again, they would always rely on doing some good visual research first, building some style frames and design boards so I have a sense of where I'm going. Then putting my assets together into one work file so that I can import one composition, and then I have all the elements that I need, or as many of them as I think I need right away, and I can start testing out some of those movements and how those things work together on the screen. Okay, keep working.